The TEFL Commute, Season 3, Episode 5, Versus, in which we get in the ring of ELT and discuss some of the big dichotomies that exist in our profession.
Tonight, we are going to witness the most anticipated match for the heavyweight championship of the world. Are you ready?
In the red corner, weighing an even 261 pounds,
Sean Middleton.
Fighting out of the blue corner, wearing black with gold, official weight 217 pounds.
Lindsay Clanfield.
Black and blue. God versus man. Day versus night.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Right, Sean,
Hey.
ready?
I'm ready. You ready?
I was away last week, so I'm back now, or last episode rather. I'm back now, and oh boy, am I ready for this one.
Oh, I bet you are. I mean, actually, it was a real nice change talking to Kerry. It was yeah. No.
Yeah. It's good to mix it up a little bit.
But we're back with vengeance. After that intro, I'm really rearing to go. So,
Yeah.
so it's not really Sean versus Lindsay, though, is it? No, we should go.
Let's be clear, it's not Sean versus Lindsay. What we're doing is to, in no way are we trying to ride the marketing hype on Batman versus Superman, which is coming out at this time, but we decided that it just was something that we wanted to do, a versus episode. But before we launch into the ELT side, Sean, let's just go back and forth on some famous versuses, all right? I'm going to say one, then you say one, and I'll say one, and we'll keep going until we run out of ideas. So we'll start with the one that gave us the idea for this episode, Batman versus Superman. Your turn.
Okay. Then I will trump you with Captain America versus Iron Man.
Okay, off of the comics now, I'll go Coke versus Pepsi.
Always Coke. Apple versus Android. How about
Mac
that?
versus PC.
Yeah. Okay. What about? Oh well, being a geek, Star Wars versus Star Trek.
Oh, yeah. Okay, DC versus Marvel.
Oh, go back to the comics again. Probably apt given that it's been in the news in the UK with the death of George Martin. The Beatles versus the Rolling Stones.
Oh, good one. McDonald's versus Burger King.
Yeah, okay. PlayStation versus Xbox.
Right. Well, you can see what kind of things interest us. I'm sure other people would come up with other.
That list really does reflect us, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does rather. It's rather embarrassing, actually. Anyway, the point of doing this kind of thing is that often I think we like, not just us, but humans like to think of things in binaries, in black and white. So what would be, we were thinking about this, what would be the big binaries, the big black and whites in ELT? And I thought we would take a look at some of the most important versuses in our profession and say a few words about each one. So, sort of like not really the top, well, the most important ones, but not in any order, though.
Yeah, I mean, when you say not really top ones, they're ones that often get discussed. I mean, if you're on social media and in blog posts and stuff like that, and at conferences, I think that's what reflects our choices, isn't it? In a
Yeah, and I think there are things that kind of keep coming back over and over again. So if you've been in the profession for a certain amount of years, you'll notice like the same fight or argument or debate over these two things comes, and one seems to be winning, and then it comes back again, and another one seems to be winning. So, shall we start with, and we'll just go through each of them and say a little bit about each one, and maybe which one we think is currently winning in today's ELT climate. How does that sound?
Ooh, yeah, currently winning with a lot of provisos, perhaps. But okay, so we're going to talk about in no particular order, though. I guess, yeah. So do you want to do the first one?
Sure. Okay, so the first one is this one. I think all teachers will recognize, and most learners would recognize as well. And I think it's one of the oldest verses in English language teaching. And it's like, which English do we teach, and which English do you want to learn, or which English is easier? And I'm talking here about the big verses between British English versus American English. Sean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we've got to be. I mean, we acknowledge there are more Englishes out there, but we've just chosen British versus American English because this often comes up in staff rooms and in course books. Of course, British English wins that one hands down. End of talk. I mean, there we go.
Oh, right. You're already starting. Well, I think the thing is why we chose British English versus American English. You're right. It is for most students' minds. Those are the two main kinds of English. So that's what you hear students talking about. Schools tend to orient themselves one way or another. So they would
that's true.
have school saying we teach only British English here or American English. Exams also orient themselves one way or another. So they say, whether it's a British English or American English exam. And course books orient themselves one way or another. Now, I do believe that, I don't know, it depends. Also, depending on the country you live in, one or the other is more popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably oversimplifying, isn't it? But often in Europe, you tend to fall into British English, but naturally in the Americas, like South America, Central America as well, then you see it gravitates more towards American English.
And Asia, American English as well. Hey, Sean, have you ever heard students argue or really passionately that one variety is easier to understand than the other?
Well, the spelling rule. I've had more advanced students that would argue obviously the American spelling rules are easier. I always think now that I live in the UK again, I always find it interesting the amount. I imagine this dichotomy is something that we're highlighted to, but then in British English, I think a lot of British English speakers wouldn't realise when they're using American English or not. It's so pervasive now.
Well, that's true. I think in the past there would be also kind of, you could do a lesson on like which of the words are the British English words and which words are the American English words. You get your like truck, lorry, and stuff like that. But now, in British English you say truck quite a bit as well now, don't you?
Well, I like to say lorry, but
okay. Elevator or lift? What do you?
It's definitely a lift.
Okay. So
is it the ones that always get me are because I like cooking, the herbs, your herbs and your herbs like oregano and oregano and basil and basil,
aluminum and aluminium.
Yeah, although you shouldn't really cook with that, it's probably not going to do you much good. But
so I don't know if we could say which is the clear winner. Although I think the days in the past where people would say, "Oh, that's not really right. I don't think that sounds right. It's probably American English." Do you think that still happens? Do you think still teachers around the world say that when, "Oh, I don't think that's correct. Maybe it's American." I used to.
I would pin it on inexperienced teacher.
Yeah.
And I think when you start your profession, you tend to you're walking into it with the language aren't you? And then kind of. Obviously, the longer you teach, the more you're exposed to different Englishes and different things, and then you get a feel for it. It's like any kind of language awareness for it. I do recall people. Typically on the 4-week training courses, Americans tripping over the use of the present perfect, for example.
Oh yeah,
that always gives me a sly chuckle at the back of the room when I'm observing them. Yeah. But I think I would say I would say that in a versus, it's a good staff room banter kind of thing. But I think these days, actually, if I had to say which was winning, American English is probably the one that is.
I think so too.
More used and more international. Simply because of our exposure to American media. But that would be me. If I had to choose a winner, I'm going to go American. There you go.
All right, let's move on to the next one.
So, native speaker versus non-native speaker, Lindsay.
Ooh, this is a really politically charged one. We're gonna have to.
Yeah, I'm just putting all the eggshells down, so I can.
Yeah, let's start walking. Well, native speaker. Let's just to explain. If for some reason someone's listening and doesn't know what this verse is about, we're talking about a native speaker of English versus the non-native speaker of English. So, Sean and I are both native speakers versus teachers of English. For example, I live in Spain, who are Spanish, their first language is Spanish, and they're teaching English. So already there, we could start having an argument over what do we mean by a native speaker?
This is always an interesting one. I mean, I think in all the verses that we're probably going to mention over this episode, this is the one that's probably the most current. Would you say the one that's?
I think so. Over the past 20 years, I think this has become more.
And I think, well, I actually think as well over the last year, it's gained a lot of focus. I think that rightly so.
Yeah.
Because if I look at it from a pure legal point of view, from the European Union, I mean, this idea that everybody in the European Union is free to work and whatever, and this idea that job adverts ask for native speakers only, I think really has brought those back into focus. Rightly so. It's a strange. It's a strange profession, which I've always been joking about this native speaker, because when I used to teach in the Czech Republic, so the native speakers were Czech, surely. But anyway.
Yes. Oh, well, that's true as well. I think the other thing about the native versus non-native speakers, it doesn't just touch on sort of the teachers, although the teachers are the one part of it, but the power, the books that are written, the publishing, the authors, the speakers at conferences, all of that kind of thing, the voices that are heard in the profession tend to be more native speaker versus non-native speaker. I think that is changing, but it is still probably, it's an issue of power. If we had to say who is winning in terms of sheer numbers, well, the non-native speakers. I think they outnumber native speaker teachers vastly. Another way to say this versus is the NEST, native English speaking teacher, versus the NNEST, 2N-E-S-T, non-native. And I think the NNESTs vastly outnumber the NESTs.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing about the native speaker versus non-native speaker versus also tends to be about knowledge of language. While this is not always true, a generalization is sometimes made that the non-native speaker actually has an edge over the native speaker in knowledge of, like, grammar, for example, whereas the native speaker might know more colloquial or idiomatic terms. The non-native speaker will have a better grasp of the grammar and also of what difficulties their learners might have in learning it.
Well, primarily because they've learned the language themselves.
Exactly. So while I'd say numerically non-native speakers win in this versus, probably in terms of power, regretfully, I'd probably still say that native speakers do get the edge in this. Also, if you look at private sector language teaching advertisements, still to this day, I was reading something on Facebook where they still have, require native speaker teacher, or schools that sell themselves as we only hire native speaker teachers.
Yeah, it's
depressing, isn't it?
It is. I just find it very depressing from that point of view, and especially certainly in the private sector, where the native speaker has probably got 4 weeks training, as opposed to the non-native speaker who's got a degree in teaching a language.
Exactly.
It is very strange, and whether you agree with Jenkins' theory of English lingua franca and stuff like that, I mean, it's most likely that you don't need this native speaker model of language to get by. Exactly. It's something that seems to be perpetuated unnecessarily with it.
Let's move on to our next one then. Okay, so the third one, number 3, this one we're back on now, let's say more methodological and less political grounds. Fluency versus accuracy. Sean, why don't you explain to...
Are we talking fluency and accuracy in speaking?
Yeah, in language production, let's say.
Okay. All right.
So explain what they mean.
Well, obviously, fluency, being able to communicate really without, I would say, would you agree, without thinking too much, without worrying too much, just going for it. Where in accuracy, you are, or as my Czech students were, very concerned about getting the right tense and the words into the right order.
Yes. So which is, I think here, I could definitely come down on the side of which one I think is winning in current methodology of language teaching. I would probably say fluency is winning, isn't it?
But I wonder if there's a versus within that, because I wonder if students, and I think it depends on the students, but there'll be a certain group of students who would prefer accuracy. I mean, if you ask them between the two, I think.
Yes. Yes, you would get students that would prefer, I think in terms of methodology, in terms of like talks, conferences, methodology books, activity books, and course books, fluency is probably being fluency is prized, but I actually ask students, maybe they would say accuracy.
Yeah, because I think fluency is a very teacher-driven thing, and I mean that by the fact that students often have to be. I think when you begin a language course, or certainly when I begin a language course with my students, and we probably discuss what fluency is, and they don't understand it from that point of view because they're very used to producing their own language in an accurate way within a classroom setting. So teachers kind of have all this idea of fluency and think that fluency is a good idea, but the students perhaps need to be shown that way a little bit, and having been shown that, then they'll realise and build confidence.
Yeah.
But this came to me as I was speaking. That I think that there's a dichotomy within the dichotomy.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing is people say that the pendulum swings one way and then swings the other, and maybe. There might be a push back towards accuracy eventually after the push towards fluency.
Well, I guess there's still accuracy needed in often an answer to any language question is, it depends on the context, or it depends. And I think accuracy is still going to be paramount. I mean, with exam students or
exactly.
Even in business communication.
Enough, I would say that accuracy would be making a comeback the more we have online automated systems for language learning. So like Duolingo or the things, other language learning programs and stuff would be focusing more on accuracy. They can't capture all of the fluency nuances.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
And I guess that's one of the, we've discussed this sort of in our episodes. This is one of the reasons why technology really isn't taking over language production, because it's bound by parameters. Although looking at the growth of artificial intelligence, I'm not sure how long this will last, given that artificial intelligence has come on leaps and bounds. I know it's an aside, if you've been following the Go match that's been taking place between the computer and the human, then
that's another versus, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Computer versus human.
Computer versus human. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think fluency. I always think fluency is the goal, and with it, does accuracy matter that much if you've got intelligibility?
Well, shall we take a break? We're halfway through our versuses. I think it's time maybe for one of your games, Sean. What do you think?
Oh, I like my little games. So here we go. Welcome to Timeline, the TEFL Commute's on-the-move game for teachers. Okay, in order to play Timeline, you need to draw yourself a mental timeline. We've all used timelines in the classroom. Get the pen, draw a line. Over here on the left is usually the past, moving towards the right it's the future, with somewhere with a little cross or an intersection for now in the middle. So draw yourself that mental timeline now. Great, so you're almost ready to play. All you need now is the topic, and of course today's topic is the topic of verses. Ooh! That's right, we're going to explore the verses a little bit more. At the beginning of the podcast, Sean and Lindsay talked about things that were verses, so we'll look at those things and decide where to put them on the timeline in order of when they were formed, discovered, or invented. Okay? Ready to go? Just to be clear, so you're going to add the thing on the timeline in the year that it started, invented, and so on. So with Star Wars and Star Trek, you would put Star Trek on the timeline before Star Wars. If you were very accurate, you would put Star Trek here for 1966 and Star Wars for 1977. So here we go with the other verses that Lindsay and I mentioned. So let's begin with the superheroes. So Batman versus Superman. Where would you put those on the timeline, and which would you put before the other one? Okay, so let's go to our soft drinks, and we've got Coke versus Pepsi. So are they before or after the superheroes, and then which one came first within that? After our drink, we probably need some food, so let's go fast food. So McDonald's versus Burger King. Okay, so which of those came before the other one, and did they come before or after Coke and Pepsi, Superman, Batman? You got the idea? Okay, there's only 4 left, so Now is the battle of the pop groups. So where would you put the Rolling Stones and the Beatles? And finally, in the world of computing, we've got Apple versus Microsoft. So you should have 10 things on your timeline, and the order of which we'll find out in a moment. Just to recap those 10 things, we were looking at Superman versus Batman, Coke versus Pepsi, McDonald's versus Burger King, the Rolling Stones versus the Beatles, and Apple versus Microsoft. Okay, thinking time. Lots of potentials for a big smug prize today, as there are 10 marks for getting everything in the correct order on the timeline, and we could give away 10 bonus marks for each correct year. Okay, so first of all we'll go through the verses, and then we'll put the timeline in the full order. So first up was Superman versus Batman, and Superman came before Batman by 1 year. So Superman first appeared in 1938, and Batman first appeared in print in 1939. Remember, the source of our facts is the font of all knowledge, Wikipedia, so there may be some inaccuracies. On to Coke versus Pepsi. Coke is one of those things they first learnt about in a course book. So Coke versus Pepsi. Coke was first done in 1886, and Pepsi has a bit more checkered history, but most people would say 1898. So Coke comes before Pepsi. On to the fast food, McDonald's versus Burger King. Well, Burger King was the first one there. Burger King started in 1954, with McDonald's coming 1 year later in 1955. Onto the battle of the pop groups, you've got the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. Of course, the Beatles were formed in 1960 and the Rolling Stones in 1962. Which takes us finally to our computer companies. Microsoft was 1975 and Apple was 1976. So in full timeline order, you should have Coke, Pepsi, Superman, Batman, Burger King, McDonald's, Beatles, Rolling Stones, Microsoft, and Apple. And if you got all those correct, well done. And join us again in a future podcast episode for another edition of Timeline.
Okay, that was interesting. How many people got that right?
I like the interesting. So you're always so dismissive of my games and my jokes, Lindsay.
They're always interesting. Anyway, let's continue with our verses. We were halfway through. We had done British English versus American English, native speaker versus non-native speaker, fluency versus accuracy. The next one is another methodological great favorite one, TTT versus STT. Sean, explain to our maybe one listener who doesn't know what that is.
Well, TTT is always interesting because that's one of those acronyms. I mean, obviously here we're using it to mean teacher talking time, but it's also test, teach, test, isn't it?
That's true. Task, teach, task.
Task, yeah. So I mean, TTT is a very useful acronym. James, there's a whole sub thing on TTT there for you in a future terminology episode. So teacher talking time versus student talking time, which I always think is oversimplified.
Of course, these are all black and whites, and we all know that there's 50 shades of gray for these. But on teacher training courses for a long time, it was almost TTT is bad and STT is good. So you could get marked down. I was marked down on one of my observed lessons when I first was trained around 20 years ago that my TTT was high. And that I needed to get more STT. Of course, there's been some pushback on that, hasn't there?
Well, there has. I think. I think with TTT, you have to again oversimplify it. But another versus is good TT versus bad TT.
Yeah.
I think at times, if you're engaged in a dialogue with the students, or you're providing an authentic listen, if I'm telling you a story, a joke or something that's happened to me, or then surely that's good TTT because it's authentic listening. Bad TTT, the maybe I would define as the teacher that just loves the sound of their own voice. But there has been pushback. And going back to the episode we did a couple of a couple ago, behind the closed doors. What I find frightening is that when observation, there are a number of observations that take place which grade the success of the lesson on the ratio of TTT versus STT, which I almost think is impossible to do.
You mean just on pure time?
Yeah,
pure
just looking at that,
the other.
and that's the feedback form. I've seen many a feedback form where it's being plotted, and that actual percentage is determining the success of the lesson.
So I think we could safely say that it is a very current versus. It's
very much. I think it comes up. I think you'll find it all over the place.
In which case, who's winning this versus then? STT probably. TTT is winning, and that it's probably got more. But STT in the literature is winning as like what we want.
STT is what we're aiming for, although I would say TTT is making a comeback.
Yes.
If I take good TT, then this idea of we'll talk about this when we get to the next one on the list, in fact. But I think good TT, there's a recognition of that role of the teacher is making a comeback in teaching, whereas as you say, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, and perhaps nearer, it was almost like we were almost going to the silent way, that the teacher pushed everything towards
the students.
So
okay, let's go on to the next one then, number 5.
Okay, so number 5 is one that I have to be careful on. So Dogme versus course books. Lindsay.
Can we cue like some really scary, blood-curdling scream here for me as a coursebook writer? Okay, so Dogma versus coursebooks. If for some reason you don't know what we're talking about, coursebooks are what teachers take into class to teach from, and Dogma was a movement started by Scott Thornbury in the late 90s, I think early 2000s, then with Luke Meddings on a materials light approach to teaching, which, amongst other things, advocated focusing on conversation and emergent language and on reducing the number of materials. This then quickly became a versus over whether or not you teach with published materials or not. Are you a Dogma teacher or a coursebook dependent teacher?
Which I think was completely missing the point of Dogma. And people who know me know that I have spoken against Dogma quite a lot, which is why I need to be careful. But I think that dichotomy was missing the point. It was always like, you can't use a coursebook now. They never said that. That never came out of the movement, did it?
No, but it gave rise to a lot of that. The kind of discourse tended to naturally progress to that discussion. Whether you do or not. And I don't think we want to get into a whole Dogma thing. In fact, when we started this podcast, we said we would be for language teachers without talking about language teaching. And we weren't going to get into some of these big versuses. So we're just going to scratch.
This is the 3rd episode in a row where we've talked purely about language teaching.
I know. Time to do some other things. Notice how we're both feeling more and more uncomfortable about talking about Dogma. No, actually, no, Dogma is great. It did a lot of good for many teachers. I think lots of teachers, it almost became a sort of passage of your development to experiment with Dogma or with materials-free teaching, and just using the resources and the people in the room. And I think in that case, it's been very successful. Whether or not, if we were saying which one of these two is winning, well, I know most people would probably say that coursebooks are, because even though we've had now up to 20 years or 10, 15 years of Dogma, it has not really slowed the sales or take up or use of coursebooks. You don't see schools not many schools, very few schools sort of saying we use no materials at all.
I'd be interested. Yeah, I think there's so. I look at it perhaps a different way. I would say that using actually a tech term, I would say that Dogma is now normalized, so we don't talk about it as much, and it's become so. It's not necessarily a versus. I think they both.
So do you think the
coexist?
Of all of our verses so far, do you think this one is the one that is the least controversial now, or do you still? The thing is I hardly meet any people who are completely on the coursebooks side. Even coursebook authors, and myself included, will have quite a bit of time for Dogma at certain points of.
Absolutely, I think. Well, I actually do think it's calmed down a little bit. I think that I think if you go back a year or two ago, they used to be, almost what I call Twitter slams. In fact, between
Trust me, I have the scars. I have the scars.
it was almost, and the same happened with technology to a certain extent. But it was almost evangelical followings of it, and that would not take any dissent. And I just think now it's become, everybody's accepted it. It's normal. We know it's got more into the mainstream of teaching, and I would say that I wouldn't say that it's necessarily dogma versus course books, but it's become kind of dogma and course books. And in fact, both are, and you could add another versus self-published material, authentic material, because that's
true.
That's such a wide category now. So no material or which material from it. But yeah, no, I think to answer the question you just asked me, I think yes, that this is possibly the least verses. Although in modern ELT history, it's been quite a big verses.
Yes, yes. Let's move on to. We're coming to the end of the episode, so I think it's time to do our last one in our list.
So. Grammar or Lexis, Lindsay?
Yes. Okay, so this verse is here on whether or not what should be more emphasized in language teaching, grammar or Lexis, or vocabulary, if you like. Gosh, yeah, I would say there was a time when I've been utterly convinced that I would have said Lexis every single time. Lexis over grammar. Although when I started teaching, it would have been grammar first and Lexis is what you kind of hang on it. But then I read the lexical approach and like so many other teachers was completely convinced by it when I first read it. And I was completely like, it's all about the chunks, guys. It's all about the chunks. But now I guess I'm sort of coming down on both sides. I don't know. I certainly would say that this one here is hard to say. I'd still say if you ask me which is winning in our profession, grammar or Lexis, I'd say grammar is, but not as much as it was in the past.
I'm gonna go. Sitting so far on the fence that the poll hurts. No, I'm gonna go back to what I said about fluency and accuracy. Actually, I think it depends on the way you look at it. I think many students would see that if you said grammar or Lexis, the students would go grammar. If you said to teachers grammar or Lexis, you get more teachers say Lexis. And I certainly think you've got like the work of Leo and Hugh and stuff. I think the lexical approach is kind of finding its feet again, and coming forward. So I think we've realised you can get by much more with Lexis than grammar these days. And I would say that from a teacher point of view, Lexis is winning. But maybe it's because I am secretly a lexical approach. Well, not secretly. I prefer Lexis to grammar. So yes. Maybe as a teacher.
I think the other thing is, there's been several famous phrases uttered in this verses. One is like when students travel, they take phrase books with them, not grammar books, or language is grammaticized Lexis, not lexicalized grammar, or have I got that the wrong way?
I can't remember. I was just thinking back to, just going back to, again, our geekdom and the fact that I guess these days, that Lexis is possibly less important because you can find it on your phone, but and these translators that we talked about in a previous episode come forward. But I think again, course books perhaps take a more course books tend to take a more grammatical approach.
Oh yes, well, that's for sure. As I think if you looked in the world of course books, then grammar probably does win because there are very few that have tried to do just a purely lexical syllabus. And the first starting point tends to be grammar syllabus, and that's a whole other kettle of fish that we could get into. Sean, I think it's time for a little bit of Facebook philosophy.
The angelic voice is to calm us down after all these verses.
Every student can learn, just not on the same day or in the same way. George Evans.
Feeling calm now?
Well, the angelic voices always do it for me.
The angelic voices and the man's voice who reads us. We'll have to have him on the show one time.
Well, his name came up today, didn't it, actually?
Yes. Let's keep it a secret for now, who our Facebook philosopher is. But in the meantime, let's just recap before we finish our episode here. Can you remember what our 6 verses that we took? Sean, what were they?
Okay, so the first one we talked about, British English versus American English. Lindsay, number 2?
native speaker versus non-native speaker, the most politicized of our verses, we believe.
Which kind of led us into number 3 naturally, which was fluency versus accuracy.
Yes. Another methodological versus was TTT, teacher talk time, versus STT, student talk time.
And the one that we decided we perhaps isn't a versus anymore is dogma versus course books.
And the last one, which is quite methodological still, and we weren't sure which one was winning so much in this, was grammar versus Lexis. Of course, if you've been listening to this episode and you think we have missed out some, we had a longer list. They included things like IELTS versus TOEFL, which we weren't. These were ones that didn't make it to the final cut, but the IWB versus the WB, so which kind of brought up the whole like technology versus no technology. Many of you are maybe thinking, why didn't we talk about that? Big issue. Maybe it's worth another whole episode. Sean, what were some of the other ones that we were going to say?
Oh, well, I think we compared course books at one point, which we won't mention.
Yes.
Also, I guess the idea of one-to-one teaching versus group teaching, which is perhaps more effective.
Yeah. And certification of teaching certificates, Cambridge versus Trinity, but that's getting quite specific now. None of these struck us as big as the other 6 verses that we went through. However, if you disagree, please leave us a note on our Facebook wall of the TEFL Commute or at our website, www.teflcommute.com, or you can just shout at us on Twitter, right?
Oh, yeah, although shouting at us on Twitter, that doesn't sound very nice. Gently poking us.
Gently poking us on Twitter.
Right, Lindsay, should we go away and get ready for our big fight?
Yes, let's do that then. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Have a good weekday, month, whatever. Bye for now.
Bye.
As your commute is coming to an end, here's an activity you can take into class. Think of verses, like the one that Lindsay and Sean mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Nominate a student and give them the 2 words as a choice. For example, Coke or Pepsi. Ask them to choose which they prefer and why. They answer and then think of another choice of 2 things, people or places. They nominate another student to answer. Students cannot repeat the same choices. Continue this way until all students have asked and answered. You can find the instructions for this activity at our website, teflcommute.com. You've been listening to the TEFL Commute, an original podcast produced and presented by Lindsay Clanfield, Sean Wilden and James Taylor. Don't miss out on any episodes by subscribing to us on iTunes and by visiting us at teflcommute.com.
Let's get ready to rumble.
Let's get ready, let's get ready, let's get ready to rumble. Watch us wreck the mic, watch us wreck the mic, watch us wreck the mic. Psych!